First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Luka Bosic and Dr. Pavel Gregoric for having me here. I'm deeply honored to deliver the Frane Petrić Annual Lecture at the prestigious Philosophy Institute in Zagreb. And my paper is somehow complementary to Pavel Gregoric's paper, at least if I understood his paper correctly, since I will now talk about time after Pavel talked about space. I will start with a famous quotation from Process and Reality by Alfred of Whitehead. There, Whitehead characterizes the European philosophical tradition as a series of footnotes to Plato. Well, this formula is very famous, it's very effective, but I think it is potentially misleading on several counts. First of all, the expression European somehow understates the breadth of Plato's posterity, which embraces Greek, Latin, Syriac, Arabic, Hebrew traditions in equal measure. But more importantly, footnotes suggest that all substantive philosophical content was already present in Plato, and that subsequent authors did no more than make it explicit through marginal additions. Whitehead himself qualified the claim immediately. It means not the systematic scheme of thought scholars have extracted from Plato's writings, but the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. But even in this attenuated form, the formula risks obscuring a defining feature of the Platonic tradition, in my view. It's essentially transformative rather than merely explanatory or explicative character. And the reception of Plato's Timaeus on the question of time offers a particularly instructive case. Plato's account in the dialogue ties the nature of time inseparably to the ordered motion of the celestial bodies. Time, on this view, is not a container within which events occur, but the character of the celestial motions themselves. Well, this position is of course deeply different from Isaac Newton's absolute time, which flows uniformly without relation to anything external. And yet, the long philosophical exegesis of the Timaeus, from antiquity through Renaissance and into the 17th century, produces, so to speak, the conceptual instruments that underlie Newton's absolute time. The tradition that begins with Plato, tying time to the heavens, and by severing that tie definitively. Understanding this path requires attending not only to what each successive author takes from the Platonic heritage, but also to what they add, modify, or even reverse, and to the rival traditions, above all Aristotelianism, against which the Platonic conception is progressively defined and sharpened. Well, let's start with Plato's Timaeus. In that dialogue, Plato describes how a divine craftsman, the demiurge, so this term simply means craftsman, fashions the physical world after an eternal and perfect intelligible model. The account, Plato's account, is offered as an eikos mythos, a likely or reasonable account. Why so? Because the discourse about the physical world, which is an image of the perfect intelligible world, cannot attain the rigor proper to discourse about what truly and immutably is. So just as the sensible cosmos is an approximation of its intelligible model, so the discourse, the logos, about the cosmos is an approximation of the discourse about eternal and invariant being. Within this framework, time is introduced as an instrument through which the demiurge brings the sensible world as close as possible to its intelligible model. And since the model is eternal and it is impossible to make a generated thing fully eternal, The demiurge produces instead a moving image of eternity that progresses according to number, while eternity abides in unity. This image is what is called time. So this is the framework of Plato's Timaeus, with the famous passage about the stages of the dialogue as a nekos mythos. Two aspects of this account are very important for the subsequent tradition. First, time progresses according to number, kata arithmon. So the numerical progression is the closest approximation a generated reality can offer to the unified self-identity of the eternal model. The numerical structure of time is not a mere feature of our measurement of it. It belongs, so to speak, to its very essence, expressing the most perfect imitation of eternity that a mobile reality can achieve. Second, time is essentially linked to celestial motion. In the Timaeus, the duration of time coincides with the ordering of the heaven. So the demiurge produces the soul of the word, an intermediate principle between the intelligible model and the body of the cosmos, endowed with mathematical structure and circular motion. And the demiurge places the star on the soul's circles, rendering its movement visible. The regular motions of the stars produces the pass of time, day, month, year, which serve as the standard for measuring all other cosmic processes. Here we'll quote a passage from Alfred Edward Taylor's commentary on Plato's Timaeus. It's a classic commentary to this dialogue, and Taylor, some 1 century ago, drew out the philosophical implications of this picture. Platonic time, he argues, is not something existing before, after, or beside the events that make up the life of nature. It's not a kind of frame into which events are inserted, which might retain a structure of its own even if in the absence of events to fill it. It is itself a character of events, an expression of the most universal feature of nature, its process, its passage. And as you can see, fully thought out, this picture implies a contrast vis-à-vis Newton's absolute time. Newton's absolute time would be, according to Taylor, a phrase without meaning to Plato, for Plato. I would now mention a recent interpretation of Plato's Timaeus, an interpretation developed by a French scholar, Rémy Brague, who has argued in a much more radical vein that in that relevant passage, the demiurge does not make time an image of eternity, but fashions the heaven as the image, with the number according to which it advances being what we call time. So on Brague's reading, the traditional definition of time as the moving image of eternity would unduly separate time from the heaven and obscure Plato's real position. This hypothesis has not been regarded as very convincing. It is possibly exaggerated, but it has at least the merit of bringing into sharp focus the constitutive link between time and the heaven. That's at least an interesting feature of this reading. Whatever the formulation of the Timaeus might have been, it is the ordering of the celestial motions that is for Plato the very essence and substance of time. This is the starting point from which tradition departs, and I would now add a second piece to this puzzle, that is Aristotle's account of time in Book 4 of the Physics. There, of course, both Plato and Aristotle's account of time are very controversial. I am now just offering a general picture of these views. Well, Aristotle, once again, ties time to change in an stricter way. Why so? Because time is, according to Aristotle, nothing else than the countable order of change. Time is therefore the number of movement according to before and after. Of course, there is a certain account of motion underlying this account of time. According to Aristotle, motion is provided with a structure according to the before and after, with a starting point and an end point, and time is the number of this inherent structure. Within this framework, as Aristotle says, our soul provides the counting. When it marks off successive nows, it counts the before and after that change exhibits. And this counted order is time. Not only are the parts of time generated by celestial motion, but time is in its very essence the number of that motion in Aristotle's account of time. Well, what happens in the subsequent Platonic tradition is that in critically discussing Aristotle's account of time, the Platonic tradition comes to separate time and movement, and even celestial movement, in a way which is, of course, quite different from what we find in Plato's Timaeus. But as a matter of fact, the Timaeus opens without fully resolving. The Timaeus opens a number of important questions. I singled out at least 3 questions: QA, QB, QC. Well, the epistemological question, first of all, of the relationship between time and knowledge. Then there is the psychological question of the relationship between time and the soul. And then the physical question of the relationship between time and the motion of bodies. Let's start with the epistemological question, time and knowledge. Well, Plato emphasizes that the forms of time, was and will be, cannot be properly applied to the eternal, which admits only of is, some kind of eternal present. Since time is by nature an unstable reality subject to continuous change, time eludes the kind of complete conceptual clarification possible for invariant objects. Will and will be are created aspects of time which we thoughtlessly and mistakenly apply to that which is eternal. Only is truly belongs to eternity, while was and will be are properties of things that change over time. Well, in this page, Plato's signals a difficulty. That is that time, it is of course a constitutive dimension of experience and discourse, yet its nature resists the sort of rigorous definition appropriate to invariant object of knowledge. And this very difficulty is very important for the subsequent tradition. The epistemological problem is deepened in the 2nd century by the Dr. Galen. You see Galen discussing with Hippocrates in a medieval fresco from Anagni in Italy. Galen, who was both a doctor and a philosopher at the time of Marcus Aurelius, so the 2nd century AD, approaches the Timaeus in at least 2 different contexts. He wrote a paraphrase of Plato's Timaeus. This paraphrase is lost in Greek but preserved in Arabic. He wrote a commentary on the medical sections of the Timaeus, so without engaging with time. And he wrote a long treatise on demonstration, Peria Podexios, lost in Greek, but we have several testimonies about this treatise, both in Greek and in Arabic, because the Arabic tradition knew at least part of it. And in that treatise, Galen engaged with Aristotle's account of time and with Plato's account of time. Well, in a passage transmitted by by the Arabic scientist Ibn Majah, Galen's conclusion is reported as follows. One must content oneself with what people commonly know about time, since its substance eludes the mind. Note that Galen says that the substance of time is, so to speak, too difficult to, the first passage in the slides, is too difficult to be fully and scientifically explained. This is not some kind of epistemic defeatism about time. Galen does not want to suggest that we don't know anything about time. What he wants to suggest is that time is not that kind of item which allows for a fully, completely scientific explanatory definition. It is primitive, but we don't need to define it completely. Well, this predicament, that is that we don't know, we are familiar with time, what we face difficulties in fully defining time, is developed with greater philosophical depth in Plotinus' treatise on eternity and time. So we are in the 3rd century. There are several hints suggesting that Plotinus was familiar with these arguments from Galen, and in that treatise, presenting itself as a commentary on Plato's Timaeus and a systematic critique of rival theories, above all Aristotle's, but in that treatise, Plotinus begins by observing that eternity and time are spoken of constantly and with apparent confidence, as if they were self-evident, but when examined closely, thought becomes confused, definitions multiply, and one reaches for the authority of early philosophers without grasping the meaning of what one is saying. It is precisely this situation of difficulty that generates philosophical inquiry. Very interestingly, to express the elusive character of time's origin, Plotinus employs a device, a rhetorical device, the prosopopeia, personification. So Plotinus invites time itself to report how it came into being, noting that one could not invoke the Muses to tell how time came to be. I think I have a slide on that. Yes, that's a nice picture of the Kyriakos Muses. And, well, the Muses did not exist at the point when time was generated, so we have to ask time itself. Why didn't the Muses exist? Well, you all know that the Muses are the daughters of memory, and memory already presupposes time. So, whereas the Muses were often invoked in this kind of situations, Plotinus cannot really rely on them. So this device, this rhetorical device, the personification, signals that what is about to be described as an event, the emergence from time from eternity, is in reality not an event at all, and thus cannot be properly narrated in the temporal terms that narrative requires. Plotinus' positive definition is that time is the life of the world soul in its transition from one state to another. In his metaphysical picture, the divine intellect exists in eternity. It is a perfectly unified, atemporal life that processes everything simultaneously and without succession, and the universal soul, by contrast, is restless. Unable to remain in the contemplative quiet of the intellect, the soul passes from one state to another, reaching toward the future, generating the succession of prior and posterior. This restlessness, this inability to hold everything together, is time. In this framework, time is not measured by the soul. It is the very mode of the soul's existence, its successive unfolding. As you can see, in this way, Plotinus effects a transformation vis-à-vis Plato's Timaeus. Why so? Because there is no reference to celestial motion in Plotinus' account of time. Time is nothing else than the state of a metaphysical principle independent of bodily motion. So Plotinus separates time from celestial motion and relocates it on the metaphysical plane. In this framework, the celestial motions merely render time perceptible, manifest, but they do not generate time, and time is not essentially connected to celestial motion. Time is, so to speak, the container of celestial motions, but is not something derived from them. Before developing this issue, I would make a short digression on Augustine. Once again, Augustine was very probably familiar with Plato's treatise on eternity and time through Latin translations. But the parallels between Book 11 of Augustine's Confessions and Plotinus' treatise 3.7 are very clear. Where, as we have just seen, Plotinus moves from Plato's Timaeus and connects instead time to the world soul rather than to celestial motions. Augustine, in the 11th book of the Confessions, carries this anteriorization further within a different philosophical framework. So even if the influence of Plotinus and through Plotinus of Plato is documented, the picture is different because in Augustine's confession, we don't have a world soul. We don't have a metaphysical or cosmic principle, but we have an individual soul, the individual soul of the sinner. And in this framework, time becomes the distentio animi, the dispersion and laceration of the individual fallen soul, which remembers, attends to the present, and awaits the future. Expectat et attendit et meminit. Whereas Plotinus' time was the mode of being of universal metaphysical principle, Augustine's time is the interior condition of a finite, sinful, self-aspiring soul to gather itself in the eternity of God. You can see that the framework opened by Plato's Timaeus through different intermediate steps, so the link between time, soul, and life remains operative, but what was in Plato the ordering life of the world soul becomes in Augustine the dispersed and disordered life of the individual sinner. Augustine's celebrated formulation at the beginning of Book 11, quid est ergo tempus, sinemo ex me querat scio, si querenti explicare velim nescio. So this famous phrase is best read not as a point of departure, but for the philosophy of time, but as the end of a tradition that had progressively deepened the difficulty first raised in the Timaeus. This difficulty is original precisely because it crystallizes the chain of reflections running from Plato through Galen through Plotinus. As you can see, the footnote in this instance is not the explication of an idea already present in Plato. It is the product of a long chain of transformations that carries a Platonic insight into a new context. But it is in the third question, the relationship between time and the motion of bodies, that the transformative character of the Platonic tradition becomes most fully visible and most consequential for the history of natural philosophy. The exegesis of the Timaeus, through sustained a critical confrontation with Aristotle's rival definition, progressively dismantles the link between time and celestial motion and develops in its place a conception of time as an autonomous reality independent of all bodily motion. The philosophical instrument through which this development is accomplished can be called the inversion argument. I think I have a slide on this. The inversion argument. So whereas Aristotle defines time as number of change with respect to before and after, the Platonic tradition proposes the inverse relation. It is motion. It is it is time that is measured or generated by motion, and not the other way around. Within this framework, time is the container of motion, and motion is the instrument through which time is made accessible and visible, so to speak. Very interesting, the first formulation, at least as far as I know, of course, Aristotle's definition of time had been the focus of discussion even within the Peripatetic tradition. Peripatetic philosophers such as Stratus or Lampsacus had extensively discussed Aristotle's definition, but the inversion argument according to which time is not the measure of motion but is measured by motion, as far as I know, first occurs in Galen. In his paraphrase of the Timaeus, Galen presents the celestial bodies as the instruments of time. So they do not produce time, but simply make time accessible to measurement. So the portions of time that celestial motion carves out are taken from an already existing duration, independent of motion, and they do not constitute that duration. The distinction is therefore sharp. Even if the parts of time are the products of celestial motion, time itself is prior and independent of that motion. And yes, that's an Arabic testimony from Galen's De Demonstratione. I won't focus on the philological details, but what is very interesting in that testimony is that the argument is made fully explicit. Time is subsistent through itself, so it is a duration, a self-subsisting duration, has no need of motion for its existence, and motion does not produce time, but produces only day, month, and year. Time is existent in itself and is related to motion only accidentally. Within this framework, Galen also introduces some kind of thought experiment. And this thought experiment recurs in the tradition. As Galen says, if the motion of the celestial sphere were to cease, time would not thereby be abolished, since the duration of that rest would itself be in time. The experiment cuts to the heart of the inversion. If rest is in time just as motion is in time, and if the cessation of motion does not abolish time, then time cannot be derived from or identical to motion. We know this argument in Galen through Alexander of Aphrodisias, and Alexander tries to contest this argument, and Alexander insists that if the sphere were to stop, time would be abolished. It bites the bullet, so to speak. This debate sets the term within which subsequent discussion is conducted. Plotinus incorporates and systematically develops the inversion argument in his treatise on eternity and time. He subjects all motion-based theories of time to sustained critique. Time cannot be the motion of the celestial sphere, the measure of that motion, or motion in general. Against the identification of time with celestial motion, Plotinus argues that the sphere itself is in time and moves in time. It cannot therefore be identical with time, since nothing is identical with that in which it exists. And exactly. So the time is fully independent of heavenly bodies. As Plotinus says, the celestial motion manifests time, reveals time, in which itself is found. It is necessary that time itself have no place in which to exist, but that before all else it is by itself what it is. In his treatise, Plotinus repeats Galen's thought experiment and gives it a metaphysical grounding. Even if the celestial sphere were to come to rest while the soul remained active, the extent of that rest would still be measured in time, as long as the soul remains outside of eternity. Within Plotinus' metaphysics, time is the container of bodily motion, not something derived from it. It is an autonomous reality that precedes the motion occurring within it. I should add that Plotinus associates this criticism of Aristotle's account of time with the criticism of Aristotle's account of motion, since Plotinus precisely rejected the basic idea that there is a before and after in motion. According to Plotinus, motion in bodies is the instantiation of an activity which is not defined by its starting point and its end point. So the two parts of its critique vis-a-vis Aristotle go together, so to speak. Time is not the number of motion, and motion has no before and after in its internal structure. Now I will skip a number of passages, for example, the reception of Plotinus' criticism in later Neoplatonism. I would nonetheless only mention that Galen's criticism to Aristotle has an important chapter in the Arabic tradition through Abu Bakr al-Razi in the 9th century, the great doctor, the great Arabic doctor, who was deeply familiar with Galen, and he borrowed from Galen the argument against time as the number of motion from Galen's laws de demonstrazione, thus developing a theory of absolute time, so to speak. Time is, according to Razi, one of his 5 eternals alongside absolute space, matter, void, and soul. And once again, Razi distinguishes between what he calls mudda, that is absolute unmeasured duration, known immediately by the intellect without inference or demonstration, and time made determinate by the number of celestial motions. So we find the same pattern we find in Galen. Razi was not familiar with Plotinus, but he was familiar with Galen. Was Razi familiar with Plato's Timaeus? That's an open question. The thing is that the legacy of Plato's Timaeus was more often than not indirect rather than direct. So authors were familiar with people who in turn had developed their views starting from Plato's Timaeus. There are other examples of medieval notions criticizing Aristotle's account of time, but all in all, they remain rather isolated. A clear dissociation of time from all bodily motions, as far as I can see, required 2 converging conditions that only the early modern period brought together. First of all, a revival of non-Aristotelian Greek philosophies, such as Plotinus' revival through Ficino's translation in the 15th century. First condition, Ficino's Latin translation and commentary of the Aeneid first appeared in 1492. And his translation is widely read in the 16th century. It's one of the, so to speak, the bestseller of that time. The second condition is the broader crisis of Aristotle's natural philosophy that gathered force through the 16th century. What the convergence of the revival, Plotinus' revival, with the anti-Aristotelian impulse of Renaissance natural philosophy made possible was the appropriation of the inversion argument as a tool for a natural philosophical reform. The Plotinian thesis that time is the container of motion rather than its derivative could now be deployed not merely as a metaphysical proposition about the soul, but as a claim about the structure of physical reality. Now, Ficino's commentary on Aeneid 3.7 is not very much developed. It's rather cursory. We don't know why. Well, this treatise is clearly anti-Aristotelian. Ficino did not share this anti-Aristotelian approach. He was much more cautious on these issues, and maybe the metaphysics of time was not Ficino's main concern. Ficino was more interested, for example, in the theory of the soul, in other aspects of Plotinus philosophy. But whatever of this, even in this cursory form, Ficinus clearly announces the program of Plotinus' criticism of Aristotle. Note that in Ficinus' commentary, Aristotle's name does not appear. But what appears are the argument against the account of time as number of motion. What time is not, that Plotinus chapter heading, Ficinus chapter heading in his commentary, is not duration in bodily motion, not a measure, not number, not the companion of bodily motion. The anti-Aristotelian approach of Plotinus is thus presented as a doctrine, even if Plotinus' adversary is unnamed. And I think it's quite important. In the 16th century, philosophers relied on Ficinus' commentary more than they relied on Plotinus himself. But it was Ficinus' commentary which really provided the picture for further speculation. And the fact that Aristotle is not named, but Plotinus' anti-Aristotelian arguments are all there, is, in my view, quite important for what I suggest is the reception of this commentary. Of course, we can only infer that it is the reception. Ficino and Plotinus are not named in the relevant sections about time in Telesio, Bruno, and Patricius. But given Bruno and Patricius were deeply familiar with Plotinus, and given Ficinus' importance for the philosophical debate in the 16th century, and given the parallels between what we found in Telesio, Bruno, and Patricius, and Ficinus' commentary, I think there are very good reasons to suggest that Ficinus' commentary was behind that. By the way, I'm not the first to suggest this, of course. Now, some examples. Telesio, Bruno, and of course, sorry for using the Italian version of Frane Petrić name, so we are used to call him Francesco Patricius. Well, in the third edition of his De Rerum Natura in 1586, Telesio affirms that time in no way depends on motion, but exists in itself. Motion is the instrument through which time is perceived, not its substance. Is the defining formula, time is permanence, duration, and interval, not that upon which or through which, but that in which all motion and change occurs, replicates Plotinus' arguments and Ficino translation of that arguments. And the inversion argument is equally explicit. The motion of the heaven is the measure of time, not the reverse. Of course, Telesio does not inherit Plotinus' grounding of time in the life of the universal soul. For Telesio, time simply exists per se, without any psychic or metaphysical substrate. Some scholars suggest that Telesio could have been influenced by the Stoics via Sextus Empiricus. It is, of course, possible. The Latin translation of Sextus was possibly available to Telesio. Well, Sextus Empiricus reports that the Stoics regarded time as an incorporeal, conceived as self-subsistent, and this may have reinforced Telesio's conviction that time exists per se. But the inversion argument, that is, that motion measures time without generating it, is, to the best of my knowledge, not to be found in the Stoics. Is that characteristic Galenic and Plotinian argument which we find in Ficino as well. That's why I am more inclined to think that Plotinus is behind Telesio. And the same holds for Giordano Bruno, who was deeply familiar with Plotinus. In his anti-Aristotelian work on physics, the Cameracensis Acrotismus, published in 1588. You see, these are all works published around 1590, when the anti-Aristotelian debate was fully developed. Bruno reformulates the inversion as a reproach to Aristotle. Of course, this argument takes place within a wider physical picture. In Bruno's physics, the celestial sphere are dissolved, and his cosmology destroys the Aristotelian framework at its roots. There is no single universal motion of the heavens. The definition of time as the number of measure of that motion collapses entirely. Bruno argues that Aristotle, observing that without the perception of motion there is no perception of time, should have concluded that motion is the measure of time rather than time is the measure of motion. And this formulation echoes Plotinus directly. Bruno adds that thought experiment as well. Even if all things were at rest, time would still exist. If as we have just seen, this argument occurs in Gale for the first time, is then used by Plotinus within his metaphysics, and it recurs again in these anti-Aristotelian arguments in the 6th century. Within this framework, Bruno elevates duration to the rank of a genus embracing both eternity and time. And finally, Frane Petrić, in the Nova de Universis Philosophia, brings these threads together systematically within a framework that combines anti-Aristotelian, Neoplatonic, and Hermetic materials. It defines times as the permanence and duration of bodies, of corporeal things, a reality that preserves and destroys, and that is prior to motion rather than derived from it. But Petrić charges Aristotle with a series of errors, making number and measure operations of the mind into the various essence of a self-subsisting natural reality, as if our counting conferred being on something that exists independently of our act. Aristotle mistakenly made time the number of motion. Aristotle attended only to motion, ignored rest, and what is interesting, Patricius supports his points with some kind of a thought experiments. A person confined in a dark cell with no light, no sound, and nothing, perceptibly moving, still apprehends duration. That's what he's saying. The duration of the darkness, and their all. Someone outside measures the very same stretch by counting hours from the motion of light and dark. Both grasp the same duration, one through rest, the other through motion. Duration is therefore common to rest and motion alike and depends on neither. Once again, Bruno, Patricius, and Telesio do not reproduce Plotinus' metaphysics, but they reproduce Plotinus and Gale's anti-Aristotelian arguments within a different framework. I would conclude my paper with a final example. The Cambridge Platonist Harry Moore. That's very interesting because Harry Moore knew Plotinus perfectly, and he refers to Plotinus in his philosophical poems, drawing explicitly on Ennius 3:7 and citing Plotinus by name. Moore describes time as the perseverance of the motion of the soul of the word, while it brings forth in succession what eternity possesses all together and all at once. He refers readers directly to Plotinus in at 3:7, where the nature of time is more fully described. That's what Moore says. His ideas on this issue evolve. The dependence on the world soul gives way progressively to a conception of time as the eternal duration of God himself. But even within this framework, the Plotinus background persists. Well, Moore is very important in this story because apparently was the first English philosopher to advance an absolute account of time, even earlier than Isaac Barrow. And he did so at the same time with Gassendi and Van Helmont. By the way, Gassendi and Van Helmont, in turn, depended probably on people like Telesio. So we find family resemblances. Most knowledge of Plotinus is certain, explicit. His engagement with Plotinus P7 is documented. And once again, that I found it interesting. Yes, we find the three occurrences of the same thought experiment in Galen, Apud, Alexander of Rhodesias, in Plotinus, and in Henry Moore. The thought experiments according to which time would continue to exist even without motion. Even if nothing would exist, then time would exist nonetheless. Of course, most position directly anticipates the framework of the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence, in which Clarke, Newton's spokesman, identifies space and duration as the immediate and necessary consequences of God's existence. It is very, of course, difficult to single out precise connection. I'm not suggesting at all that Newton was influenced by Moore and therefore by Plotinus. What I want to suggest is that the transformations in the Platonic tradition from the ancient world through the medieval world until the early modern time, in a sense, were part of the background which made Newton's absolute time possible, so to speak. And that's why I finish with the famous scholium, with Newton's distinction between absolute time and relative time. The structure of this distinction, absolute duration in itself against the relative time produced by the measurement of motion, echoes with precision the distinction that Galen had formulated against Aristotle in his paraphrase of the Timaeus, and that Plotinus had developed into a systematic metaphysical framework in Ennead 3.7, that the Arabic tradition had elaborated through Razi, and that Telesio, Bruno, and Patricius had appropriated for Renaissance natural philosophy. I want to suggest that the philosophical presuppositions of absolute time, the dissociation of duration from bodily motion, the inversion of the measuring relation, the conception of time as self-subsisting duration, have a continuous philosophical history extending back through the Platonic exegesis of the Timaeus to Galen's first formulation of the inversion argument in the 2nd century. This history is one of the several factors, not the unique factor, of course, operating at different levels and with different degrees of directness that made Newtonian time, absolute time, thinkable. So I would conclude that I don't want to suggest that the history of Platonism is the history of a mechanical transmission. The very word transmission is not fully appropriate in my view. Reception is much better, because each time, each philosopher receives the previous tradition in a specific way, in different conditions and with different results. At each stage, the received material is reshaped according to concerns, cosmological, theological, metaphysical, or scientific, that are often distant from the original context, and the results frequently stand in tension with the doctrines that had grounded them. For example, Telesio, Bruno, and Patricius appropriate the inversion argument while discarding Plotinus' psychology and metaphysics. Moore retains the metaphysical grounding while transferring it from the word soul to divine duration. That's what he does in his major work. Newton, of course, abstracts the distinction between absolute and relative time from any explicit metaphysical framework, situating it within the context of mathematical natural philosophy. The Platonic tradition in this respect is not a tradition in the sense of a body of doctrine handed down intact from one generation to the next. There is no perennial Platonism, I would suggest. It is the tradition in the sense of a set of texts, problem, argument, and critical instruments that successive thinkers inherit, transform, and deploy in the service of philosophical projects that often differ markedly from those of their predecessors. Thank you.